the end of everything, in the old Egyptian understanding, you were weighed, not your body that was left behind in the tomb, carefully preserved, carefully provisioned for the journey, not your achievements, your wealth, your social standing, the number of cattle you had owned, or the years you had served your pharaoh. What was weighed was your heart, the soft, dark, intimate organ that the Egyptians believed was the seat of intelligence, memory, conscience, and the self, the organ that contained the full record of everything you had done in your life, every lie, every kindness, every moment of cruelty or compassion. That was placed on one side of the scale, and on the other side was placed a feather, a single feather, white and perfectly light, the feather of the goddess Maat, the embodiment of truth, justice, cosmic order, and everything that was right and harmonious in the universe. If your heart was lighter than the feather, or balanced exactly with it, you passed. You were declared a person of truth, a person whose life had been lived in accordance with Maat, and you were permitted to continue into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, where the grain grew taller than in any earthly field, and the rivers ran clear, and the people you had loved were waiting. If your heart was heavier than the feather, heavier with sin, heavier with wrongdoing, heavier with the accumulated weight of a life lived against the grain of truth, something else happened, something that was, in the ancient Egyptian understanding, far worse than death. Tonight, we will explore 10 quiet chapters on the weighing of the heart, one of the most extraordinary concepts in the history of human thought about death and what comes after it. We will begin with Maat herself, the goddess who embodied the standard against which the heart was measured, and with the Egyptian understanding of truth and order that Maat represented. We will look at the heart as the Egyptians understood it, not simply as a pump, but as the repository of the self, the seat of conscience, the organ that made you who you were. We will enter the Hall of Two Truths, the chamber in which the weighing took place, and meet the extraordinary cast of beings who presided over the judgment. We will sit with Anubis, the jackal-headed god who placed the heart on the scale. We will face Ammit, the Devourer, the composite creature who waited for the hearts that were too heavy. We will examine the 42 Assessors and the negative confession that the dead person was required to recite. We will follow the Book of the Dead, the guidebook for the afterlife journey that the Egyptians buried with their dead. We will look at what the concept of the weighing meant in daily life, how it shaped Egyptian ethics and Egyptian behavior in the living world. We will trace the weighing of the heart's influence on subsequent religious thought, including its possible influence on Christian ideas about judgment. And finally, we will sit with what endures of this extraordinary concept, with what it means for any culture to believe that the heart keeps score, that the feather is the measure, and that at the end of the journey, the universe will know exactly what you were. Before we begin, if these slow journeys through the older understanding of things bring you rest, I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel. And if the world of ancient mysteries and the mystical life speaks to you, our curated collection of nature-inspired shirts is linked in the description below. Now settle in. The hall is large and cool and very quiet. At the far end, the scale is waiting. Let us understand, as well as we can across 4,000 years, what it was for. To understand the weighing of the heart, you must first understand Maat. Maat is one of the most ancient and most fundamental concepts in Egyptian religious thought, so ancient, in fact, that she appears in the earliest texts we have from the dynastic period, already fully formed, already central to the Egyptians' understanding of how the universe worked and what human beings owed to it. She is simultaneously a goddess with a specific identity, a set of images, and a body of mythology, and an abstract principle, perhaps the most important abstract principle in the entire Egyptian cosmological framework that existed independently of any personal deity, and that the goddess Maat merely embodied and represented. The principle of Maat, which Egyptologists conventionally translate as truth, justice, or cosmic order, while acknowledging that none of these English words captures the full range of the Egyptian concept, was understood as the fundamental condition that made the universe function. Maat was what was right, what was proper, what was in its correct place and relation, what moved according to its nature without disruption or distortion. The sun rose in the morning because Maat governed the heavens. The Nile flooded at its proper season because Maat governed the waters. The grain grew in the field because Maat governed the earth. Order, regularity, predictability, the reliable operation of natural and social processes, all of this was Maat, and all of it was understood as actively maintained rather than simply given. The opposite of Maat was Isfet, chaos, disorder, falsehood, injustice, the disruption of proper relations. Isfet was not merely bad luck or unfortunate circumstance. It was a genuine force, a genuine quality that could enter the world when Maat was not actively upheld, when the proper relations between things were allowed to slip or to be violated. The pharaoh's primary religious duty was the maintenance of Maat, the performance of the rituals, the exercise of the justice, the conduct of the governance that kept Isfet at bay and maintained the cosmic order that made human life possible. Every morning as the sun rose, Maat was re-established. Every evening as the sun set and darkness threatened, the rituals of protection and maintenance recommenced. Maat as a goddess was depicted in a specific and consistent way across the millennia of Egyptian artistic tradition. She was a woman dressed in a white linen garment, seated or standing, with a single ostrich feather attached to her head by a band. The feather was her primary symbol and her most important attribute. It was the feather against which the heart was weighed, the feather that served as the measure of all things. The ostrich feather was specifically chosen for its associations. The individual barbs of an ostrich feather are of precisely equal length, making it perfectly symmetrical and balanced, an ideal image of the balance and equality that Maat represented. The selection of the feather as the measure of the heart's moral weight was not arbitrary or merely decorative. In the Egyptian understanding, the feather carried a specific quality of lightness that was the appropriate counterpart to the moral weight that sin and wrongdoing added to the heart. A life lived in truth, in justice, in accordance with Maat, produced a heart that was light, literally, in the tradition's understanding, as light as the feather itself, freed from the weight that lying, cruelty, oppression, and selfishness added to the organ that kept the record. The metaphor of moral weight is not unique to Egypt. We still speak of a heavy conscience, of the burden of guilt, of being weighed down by wrongdoing. But the Egyptians literalized this metaphor in the most specific and most dramatic way imaginable. Maat was not merely a divine personality who happened to be associated with these qualities. She was, in the Egyptian understanding, the active principle that maintained the universe, present in every just action, every truthful word, every proper relation between things. The pharaoh was said to live by Maat, to speak Maat, to offer Maat, and the offering of Maat was one of the most important ritual acts of the royal religion. A small figure of Maat, the seated goddess with her feather, was one of the objects most frequently offered in temple ritual, the king presenting the goddess of order to the gods as an assertion that the world remained in its proper condition under his stewardship. The concept of Maat also encompassed what we might call social justice, the proper treatment of the poor, the widow, the orphan, The stranger, justice in the Maat tradition, was not simply the correct application of law to disputes between equals. It was the maintenance of the proper social relationships that the cosmic order required, including the obligations of the powerful to the powerless. A pharaoh who oppressed his people, a nobleman who cheated his tenants, a merchant who used false weights, these were not merely committing social wrongs. They were violating Maat, disrupting the cosmic order, contributing to Isfet, and the heart kept score of every violation. The heart that was weighed against Maat's feather was therefore not being weighed against a simple list of prohibited actions. It was being measured against the entire moral order of the universe, against everything that was right and proper in human behavior, in human relationships, in the conduct of daily life. The measurement was total, the record was complete, and the feather, perfectly balanced, perfectly symmetrical, was the measure against which the total was assessed. The relationship between Maat and the pharaoh was one of the most important structural elements of Egyptian political theology. The pharaoh was understood as the earthly guarantor of Maat, the human being through whom the cosmic order was maintained in the visible world. This was not merely a rhetorical flourish or a piece of royal propaganda, though it certainly served those functions too. It was a genuine theological proposition about the nature of the pharaoh's office. The king was the mediating figure between the divine order and the human world, and the performance of his role in justice, in ritual, in military protection of the realm, was the means by which Maat was sustained in the face of Isfet's perpetual pressure. The concept of Isfet, the opposite and the enemy of Maat, was understood not as a competing deity, but as a quality, a condition, an absence of proper order that could infect any part of the world when Maat was not actively maintained. Isfet manifested as drought, as famine, as flood, as military defeat, as social injustice, as dishonesty in commerce, as the oppression of the weak by the strong. All of these were symptoms of the same underlying condition, the failure of the proper relationships between things that Maat was supposed to guarantee. The pharaoh who maintained Maat was a pharaoh whose realm flourished. The pharaoh who allowed Isfet was a pharaoh whose realm suffered, and the suffering was understood as the visible sign of the cosmic disorder that the pharaoh's failures had created. The temples of ancient Egypt were themselves understood as houses of Maat, spaces where the cosmic order was concentrated and maintained through ritual, where the priest's daily ceremonies ensured that the sun would continue to rise, the Nile would continue to flood, and the universe would continue in its proper operation. The ritual offering of Maat, the small figure of the seated goddess presented to the great divine images in the innermost sanctuaries of the temples, was a daily affirmation that the world remained in its proper condition, a symbolic payment to the gods for the order they maintained. The ritual was never absent, never interrupted if it could be helped, because the maintenance of cosmic order was understood as genuinely dependent on this daily performative assertion. Maat's feather was, in the end, the most demanding standard imaginable, the weight of the entire cosmic order, concentrated into a single light plume. The heart that balanced it was the heart of a person whose life had been in accordance with everything that was right. The heart that failed to balance it was the heart of a person who had fallen short, not of an arbitrary list of rules, but of the fundamental order that made life possible and meaningful. The seasonal dimension of Maat is worth dwelling on because it illuminates how the concept operated in a practical, agricultural register as well as in a theological one. The Egyptian year was organized around the annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited the rich black silt on which all Egyptian agriculture depended. The flood was understood as Maat in its most visible form, the universe operating as it should, the cosmic order expressing itself in the most direct and most beneficial way for the human community that depended on it. A flood that came on time, at the right level, not too little, which would leave insufficient soil, not too much, which would destroy crops and settlements, was the perfect expression of Maat. A flood that failed, or that came too violently, was Isfet made visible in water. The role of music and art in the maintenance of Maat illuminates a dimension of Egyptian culture that is often underappreciated. The elaborate musical performances that accompanied temple ritual, the carefully calibrated visual proportions of Egyptian art that maintained consistent ratios across millennia, the precise astronomical knowledge that allowed the orientation of temples to celestial events, all of these were expressions of the same Ma'at principle that governed the moral life: beauty, order, proportion, correctness of form. These were not merely aesthetic values, but moral and cosmic ones. The artisan who produced a beautifully proportioned figure was contributing to Maat in the same way that the judge who rendered a just verdict was contributing to Maat. The universe's order was maintained through every act that expressed it, at every scale, from the individual moral choice to the architectural commission. The relationship between Maat and the specific form of the Egyptian state is worth examining in more detail, because it illuminates why the heart-weighing judgment was not simply a private spiritual matter, but a cosmic and political one. The pharaoh's duty to maintain Maat meant that every aspect of Egyptian governance, the taxation system, the distribution of grain in times of shortage, the administration of justice in local disputes, the management of the temples and their resources, was understood as either contributing to or detracting from the cosmic balance that the feather symbolized. A pharaoh who governed well was a pharaoh who kept the universe in order. A pharaoh who governed badly, who allowed the powerful to exploit the weak, who permitted the irrigation channels to fall into disrepair, who failed to honor the gods with appropriate ritual, was a pharaoh who had introduced Isfet into the world. The stakes of leadership in this understanding were literally cosmic. The ordinary Egyptian who stood before the scales in the Hall of Two Truths was therefore participating in a system whose logic extended from the intimate scale of personal moral choice to the grander scale of cosmic order. Their honesty or dishonesty, their care or carelessness for the people around them, their observance or neglect of religious obligation, all of these registered in the same system that governed the flooding of the Nile and the movement of the stars. To live in Maat was to be part of the universe's self-maintenance. To live in Isfet was to add, however incrementally, to the weight of disorder that the universe was always working to overcome. Maat's feather was, in the end, the most demanding standard imaginable, the weight of the entire cosmic order concentrated into a single light plume. The heart that balanced it was the heart of a person whose life had been in accordance with everything that was right. The heart that failed to balance it was the heart of a person who had fallen short, not of an arbitrary list of rules, but of the fundamental order that made life possible and meaningful. The seasonal dimension of Maat is worth dwelling on because it illuminates how the concept operated in a practical agricultural register as well as in a theological one. The Egyptian year was organized around the annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited the rich black silt on which all Egyptian agriculture depended. The flood was understood as Maat in its most visible form, the universe operating as it should, the cosmic order expressing itself in the most direct and most beneficial way for the human community that depended on it. A flood that came on time, at the right level, not too little, which would leave insufficient soil, not too much, which would destroy crops and settlements, was the perfect expression of Maat. A flood that failed, or that came too violently, was Isfet made visible in water. The role of music and art in the maintenance of Maat illuminates a dimension of Egyptian culture that is often underappreciated. The elaborate musical performances that accompanied temple ritual, the carefully calibrated visual proportions of Egyptian art that maintain consistent ratios across millennia, the precise astronomical knowledge that allowed the orientation of temples to celestial events, all of these were expressions of the same Ma'at principle that governed the moral life: beauty, order, proportion, correctness of form. These were not merely aesthetic values, but moral and cosmic ones. The artisan who produced a beautifully proportioned figure was contributing to Maat in the same way that the judge who rendered a just verdict was contributing to Maat. The universe's order was maintained through every act that expressed it, at every scale, from the individual moral choice to the architectural commission. The relationship between Maat and the specific form of the Egyptian state is worth examining in more detail, because it illuminates why the heart-weighing judgment was not simply a private spiritual matter, but a cosmic and political one. The pharaoh's duty to maintain Maat meant that every aspect of Egyptian governance, the taxation system, the distribution of grain in times of shortage, the administration of justice in local disputes, the management of the temples and their resources, was understood as either contributing to or detracting from the cosmic balance that the feather symbolized. A pharaoh who governed well was a pharaoh who kept the universe in order. A pharaoh who governed badly, who allowed the powerful to exploit the weak, who permitted the irrigation channels to fall into disrepair, who failed to honor the gods with appropriate ritual, was a pharaoh who had introduced Isfet into the world. The stakes of leadership in this understanding were literally cosmic. The ordinary Egyptian who stood before the scales in the Hall of Two Truths was therefore participating in a system whose logic extended from the intimate scale of personal moral choice to the grander scale of cosmic order. Their honesty or dishonesty, their care or carelessness for the people around them, their observance or neglect of religious obligation, all of these registered in the same system that governed the flooding of the Nile and the movement of the stars. To live in Maat was to be part of the universe's self-maintenance. To live in Isfet was to add, however incrementally, to the weight of disorder that the universe was always working to overcome. Maat's feather was, in the end, the most demanding standard imaginable, the weight of the entire cosmic order, concentrated into a single light plume. The heart that balanced it was the heart of a person whose life had been in accordance with everything that was right. The heart that failed to balance it was the heart of a person who had fallen short, not of an arbitrary list of rules, but of the fundamental order that made life possible and meaningful. To understand what was at stake in the weighing of the heart, we must understand what the Egyptians believed the heart to be, which was considerably more than what modern biology tells us it is. The heart, in ancient Egyptian thought, was not primarily a pump. It was the seat of intelligence, the center of consciousness, the repository of memory, the organ of conscience, and the location of the essential self. In the Egyptian understanding, it was the heart, not the brain, that thought, that felt, that judged, that made decisions, that remembered, that was responsible for a person's actions and attitudes. The brain was, in the Egyptian medical understanding, a relatively unimportant organ. The Egyptians, who performed careful dissections during the mummification process, disposed of the brain by extracting it through the nose, apparently without considering it worth preserving. The heart, by contrast, was the one organ that was always left in the body during mummification, or if it was removed during the process, was carefully replaced, because without the heart, the person could not continue in the afterlife. The Egyptian word for heart in the context of the spiritual and moral life was Ib. The Eb was distinguished from the heart as a physical organ, in that it encompassed not just the biological object, but everything that the organ contained, the record of the person's actions, the quality of their conscience, the accumulated weight of their moral life. The I-boy was, in effect, the person's entire moral identity, made physical, located in the physical organ that the Egyptians associated with thought and feeling. The relationship between the IB and the other aspects of the Egyptian soul, the BR, the Ka, the Akaj, and the other components of the complex Egyptian understanding of the self, was intricate and evolved over millennia. The BR was perhaps the closest to what we might call the personality or the individual character, the aspect of the self that could move freely after death, that could travel between the tomb and the world of the living, that was depicted as a human-headed bird. The Ka was the vital force or spiritual double that accompanied a person through life and required nourishment after death. The Akar was the transfigured, glorified spirit that the dead person became after successfully passing through the judgment, the luminous being that existed in the company of the gods. All of these aspects of the self were understood as separating at death and requiring to be reunited for the afterlife to function properly. The mummification process, the ritual texts, and the funerary goods were all oriented toward facilitating this reunification and enabling each component of the self to function in its appropriate afterlife role. But the IB, the heart, was the component that had to face the judgment. It was the component whose quality would be assessed, whose record would be examined, whose weight would be measured. The other components of the self could only continue their afterlife existence if the heart passed its test. The heart's role as the keeper of the record of the person's life was understood in very literal terms. The Egyptians believed that the heart had watched everything, had registered everything, had retained everything. Every act of kindness or cruelty, every just or unjust decision, every true or false word, every compassionate or selfish response, all of this was inscribed on the heart, not metaphorically, but actually in a form that the gods of judgment could read. The heart was both the witness to the person's life and the record of it, a complete archive of moral experience that could not be falsified or selectively edited. This understanding of the heart as a complete, uneditable record had a specific practical implication that appears in the funerary texts. The dead person was not supposed to allow their heart to testify against them in the hall of judgment. This sounds paradoxical. How could you prevent your own heart from speaking the truth of what it knew? The answer was ritual and text. Certain spells in the Book of the Dead were specifically designed to prevent the heart from speaking against its owner at the judgment, to quieten the heart's testimony, to prevent it from revealing the full record of the person's moral failures. Spell 30b, one of the most important spells in the corpus, was addressed directly to the heart. O my heart, which I had from my mother, O my heart, which I had from my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. The spell was inscribed on the heart scarab, a large scarab beetle amulet placed directly over the heart of the mummy during the wrapping process. The heart scarab was, for many periods of Egyptian history, one of the most important funerary amulets, the one whose correct placement and correct inscription was most essential to the success of the afterlife journey. Its purpose was to serve as a kind of last-minute editorial, a way of ensuring that the heart, when placed on the scale, would not sabotage its owner's chances of a successful judgment by volunteering information that the deceased might have preferred to remain unspoken. The contradiction at the heart of this practice, The spell to silence the heart, placed alongside the judgment that could not be falsified, reflects a genuine tension in the Egyptian tradition between the desire for a coherent moral theology and the human desire to have some recourse against an absolutely rigorous accounting. The heart was the record. The gods could read it fully. The scale would reveal its weight. And yet there were spells, there were rituals, there were attempts to manage the recording and the revelation. The tradition was not entirely consistent on this point, and the inconsistency is humanly understandable. It is very difficult to build a moral cosmology that is both genuinely rigorous and genuinely hopeful, and the Egyptians, like every other moral tradition, found ways to hold both at once. The specific vulnerability of the heart to temptation, its capacity to be led astray by desire, by anger, by fear, was a central concern of Egyptian wisdom literature. The instructions of Menemope, a wisdom text from the New Kingdom period that shows remarkable parallels with the biblical book of Proverbs, and that may have directly influenced it, contains extended advice about guarding the heart against impulses that would add to its weight. Do not let your heart be hasty. Amenemope counselled, do not carry away your tongue. Quieten the heated man who is in your presence, for the man in pain will not know what he is doing. The advice to quieten the heart, to prevent it from acting on passion before reason could intervene, was fundamentally an advice about protecting the heart from the additions to its weight that uncontrolled emotion would cause. The Egyptian medical understanding of the heart was sophisticated in ways that, while not matching modern cardiology, reflected genuine observation. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important surviving medical texts from ancient Egypt, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains extensive discussion of the heart and its relationship to the body's other systems. The ancient Egyptian physicians understood that the heart was connected to every part of the body through a network of vessels. They observed the pulse and understood it as the heart's communication with the extremities, and they used this understanding in their diagnosis and treatment of disease. The medical heart and the spiritual heart were not entirely separate in the Egyptian understanding. A sick heart was a heart that might be compromised in its spiritual as well as its physical function. The ceremony of the opening of the mouth, performed on the mummy as part of the funerary ritual, was specifically intended to restore to the mummy the physical capacities, speech, sight, hearing, movement that would be needed in the afterlife. The heart that was to be weighed needed to be a functioning heart, capable of being placed on the scale and assessed. The opening of the mouth ensured that the mummy remained connected to its various spiritual components, and that the heart in particular retained its capacity to function as the seat of consciousness and conscience even after physical death. The ritual was the prerequisite for the judgment. Only a properly reactivated heart could be meaningfully weighed. The heart, in the Egyptian understanding, was the self in its most concentrated and most complete form. To stand before the scale was to have yourself, everything you had been, everything you had done, everything you had become, placed on one side of a balance. The feather was on the other, and the universe, perfectly impartial, would reveal the weight. The relationship between the IB, the moral heart, and the physical organ that it inhabited was understood in Egyptian medical and theological thought as a relationship of complete identification rather than of mere association. The IB was not a soul that happened to reside in the heart. It was the heart itself, considered in its full moral and spiritual dimension. When the embalmer removed the heart during mummification, a step that was sometimes part of the process in certain periods, the organ was treated with extraordinary reverence, often wrapped separately, often placed in a special canopic jar, or in a special case because the physical object was the ib in its physical form, and the physical form of the ib was essential to the afterlife, as the physical form of the body was essential to the ka. The spell of the heart scarab, spell 30b of the Book of the Dead, was considered so important that it was sometimes inscribed on the back of the scarab in hieroglyphs, even when the rest of the Book of the Dead was not present in the burial. The scarab itself was placed directly on the chest of the mummy, over the location of the heart, as close as possible to the organ it was meant to protect and represent. The scarab beetle was chosen as the symbol because of its association with the sun, god Khepri. The scarab pushing his ball of dung was understood as an image of the sun rolling across the sky, and this solar association gave the heart scarab its protective power. The heart, like the sun, would continue its journey and would not be stopped by the darkness it passed through. The heart amulets and heart scarabs found in Egyptian tombs across many centuries and many social levels testify to the universality of the concern about the heart's condition at the time of judgment. Museum collections around the world contain thousands of heart scarabs, some made of precious materials like lapis lazuli or carnelian for the wealthy, others made of faience or simple stone for those of more modest means. The quality of the material varied. The concern they expressed did not. Every person who was buried with a heart scarab was a person whose family and community understood that the heart would be weighed, that the weighing mattered, and that whatever protection could be offered to the heart in that moment was worth the effort and expense of providing it. The inscriptions on heart scarabs reveal the range of concerns that the people who commissioned them brought to the judgment. Some are formulaic, the standard Chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead, reproduced with professional accuracy by scribal workshops. Others show personalization, specific wishes, specific anxieties, specific aspects of the owner's life that the commissioner of the scarab felt particularly needed to be addressed. The heart scarab was, in this sense, a highly personal object, even when its text was standardized. Its presence was a declaration of faith in the system of the judgment and of hope for the outcome, expressed by people who knew perfectly well what the alternative to a favorable outcome was. The heart, in the Egyptian understanding, was the self in its most concentrated and most complete form. To stand before the scale was to have yourself, everything you had been, everything you had done, everything you had become, placed on one side of a balance. The feather was on the other, and the universe, perfectly impartial, would reveal the weight. The chamber in which the weighing of the heart took place was known in Egyptian as the Hall of Two Truths, Duat and Maat in some renderings, the Hall of Double Maat, the Hall of Complete Justice, the hall where truth was examined in its entirety. The name itself is significant. Two truths, not one. The judgment was not simply a matter of assessing the bad against some general standard of goodness. It was a weighing of the complete truth of the person's life against the complete truth of the cosmic order. Two truths facing each other across the scale, and the scale's needle indicating which was heavier. The hall's name encoded the fundamental structure of the judgment. Not accusation and defense, not prosecution and plea, but truth against truth, the truth of what you had done against the truth of what the universe required. The Hall of Two Truths, as it is most completely depicted, comes from the New Kingdom period, particularly from the papyri associated with the Book of the Dead. The most famous single image of the weighing scene, the vignette that appears in numerous papyri and that has become the iconic representation of Egyptian afterlife judgment, shows a large hall with a scale at its centre, a jackal-headed figure holding the plumb line of the scale, a baboon perched on the beam, a composite creature crouching beside the scale, a line of divine figures standing in attendance, and the deceased approaching from the left, led by the hand toward the moment of judgment. The hall itself was understood as being outside ordinary space, not in the heavens, not underground, but in the Duat, the Egyptian underworld that was neither a physical location below the earth nor a spiritual location above it, but a distinct dimension of reality that existed alongside the physical world, and that the dead entered at death. The Duat was traversed by the sun god Ra each night on his journey from the western horizon to the eastern horizon, and the journey of the individual dead person through the Duat after death was understood as parallel to and connected with the sun's journey, both movements through the same territory, both subject to the same dangers and the same possibilities of renewal. The presiding deity of the judgment was Osiris, the king of the dead, who sat enthroned at the far end of the hall, and whose verdict was final. Osiris was himself a figure of profound mythological significance, the god who had been murdered by his brother Set, who had been reassembled by his wife Isis from the scattered pieces of his dismembered body, and who had been restored to life by the combined efforts of his divine family, only to become not the ruler of the living world again, but the ruler of the dead. His own death and restoration gave him a specific authority over the dead. He understood from personal experience what it was to die, and his restoration gave him the authority to grant restoration to others. Around Osiris sat 42 divine figures, the 42 Assessors, or 42 Judges of the Dead, each associated with a specific nome or district of Egypt, and each responsible for overseeing the judgment with respect to a specific category of wrongdoing. The number 42 corresponded to the traditional number of nomes of Egypt, making the assembly of judges a complete representation of the entire Egyptian world, a jury of the whole country rather than of any particular region or institution. The dead person was required to address each of the 42 assessors individually, reciting the negative confession before each one. Present also in the hall was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, wisdom, and the moon, who served as the official recorder of the judgment, the divine scribe who wrote down the verdict and whose record was authoritative and permanent. Thoth's presence at the judgment reflected his general role as the keeper of divine records and the arbiter of disputed matters between the gods. He was also associated with the measurement and marking of time, and his presence at the weighing connected the judgment to the temporal dimension of the dead person's life, to the record of what they had done across the years that Thoth had watched and measured. The baboon that perched on the beam of the scale was associated with Thoth in his aspect as the moon, the baboon being one of Thoth's animal forms, and its position on the scale's beam indicated its role as the guardian of the scale's accuracy, the witness to the precision of the measurement. The scale itself was depicted as a standard balance scale of the type used in Egyptian commerce. The same instrument that merchants used to weigh grain and metal was employed on a cosmic scale to weigh the moral worth of a human life. The hall was not silent. The negative confession filled it with the dead person's voice, asserting their innocence before each of the 42 judges. Thoth's pen scratched the record, the scale's needle moved, and at the side of the scale, just visible, patient and hungry, crouched the figure that everyone in the hall was trying not to look at directly, the devourer, Ammit, the composite creature who waited for the hearts that were too heavy to pass. The depiction of the Hall of Two Truths, in the most celebrated of all the books of the dead, the Papyrus of Ani, now in the collection of the British Museum, is one of the most studied images in the entire history of Egyptology. Ani was a royal scribe who lived during the 19th dynasty, around 1250 BCE, and the Book of the Dead prepared for him is both exceptionally well preserved and exceptionally well illustrated. The weighing scene in the Papyrus of Ani shows Ani and his wife Tutu standing at the entrance to the hall, their hands raised in the gesture of supplication, while Anubis adjusts the scale and Thoth prepares to record the result. The feather of Maat stands on the right-hand pan of the scale. On the left pan, the heart, depicted as a small jar, awaits the moment of judgment. Ammit crouches at the scale's base, her crocodile head turned alertly toward the balance. The architecture of the Hall of Two Truths, as described in the funerary texts rather than merely depicted in vignettes, included specific features whose symbolic significance illuminated the character of the judgment. The hall had 42 gates, each guarded by a specific divine figure who had to be correctly addressed by name and given the correct password before passage was permitted. The dead person who had been properly prepared, who had memorized the correct names and passwords from the Book of the Dead, could pass through each gate and reach the scale. The person who had not been prepared was stopped at each gate and could not proceed. The architectural barriers were not arbitrary challenges, but a form of structured examination that began before the dead person even reached the scale itself. The role of the divine boat, the solar bark of Ra, in the context of the Hall of Two Truths, illuminates the connection between the individual's afterlife journey and the cosmic journey of the sun. The Book of the Dead repeatedly references the dead person's desire to travel in the solar bark, to be one of Ra's company, as he makes his nightly journey through the Duat. The Hall of Two Truths was part of this solar geography, a chamber through which the sun passed each night and through which the dead passed on their own journeys. The judgment was therefore not only a personal reckoning but a cosmic event, situated in the context of the universe's own daily renewal. The Hall of Two Truths was a courtroom, a temple, and a crossroads simultaneously. It was the place where the journey of the dead either continued into paradise or ended in something far worse than ordinary death. It was the place where the universe looked at you and said, clearly and finally, here is what you were. And the feather, perfectly still on the scale, said the same thing in a different language. The furniture of the Hall of Two Truths, the specific objects that appeared in different versions of the weighing scene, tells us something about the Egyptian understanding of what a proper judgment required. The scales were always the central object, depicted with the precision appropriate to a commercial instrument whose accuracy was fundamental to the fairness of the transaction it measured. The plumb line hung from the scale's beam, the device used in actual commercial scales to ensure that the beam was perfectly horizontal and the measurement therefore accurate, was sometimes depicted hanging from the beam, and Anubis is sometimes shown adjusting this plumb line, ensuring the calibration of the instrument before the weighing began. The detail of the plumb line was not decorative, it was a statement about the justice of the proceeding. The scale was accurate, the measurement would be true. The 60 or so deities, sometimes depicted in attendance in the Hall of Two Truths, beyond the central figures of Anubis, Thoth, Osiris, and the 42 judges, represented the full breadth of the Egyptian divine community witnessing the judgment. Their presence was both a guarantee and a statement. The judgment was conducted in full view of the entire divine world, was witnessed by beings from every part of the Egyptian cosmos, and was therefore utterly beyond dispute. No one who had been present could subsequently claim that the judgment had been unfair or incorrectly conducted. The divine community's collective witness was the ultimate guarantee of the judgment's authority. The physical survival of actual books of the dead, the papyri themselves, preserved by the dry Egyptian climate for 3,000 years, gives us direct access to the ancient experience of the afterlife journey in a way that very few ancient religious traditions can offer. Reading an actual Book of the Dead even in translation, is a strikingly immediate experience. The spells are written in the second person as often as the first. You will not be turned back at the gates. You will pass through safely. The directness of address creates a relationship between the text and the reader that erases the distance of millennia. The Book of the Dead papyri vary enormously in their artistic quality as well as their textual completeness. The finest examples, the Papyrus of Ani, now in the British Museum, is perhaps the most famous, are works of extraordinary artistic achievement, their vignettes painted with a precision and a vitality that makes them among the most beautiful objects in any museum collection. Ani and his wife Tutu appear repeatedly in the vignettes, moving through the afterlife journey in elegant linen garments, their expressions calm and composed. The artistic quality of the papyrus was itself understood as a form of preparation. The beauty of the text was part of its power, part of what made it an effective instrument for navigating the judgment. The Hall of Two Truths was a courtroom, a temple, and a crossroads simultaneously. It was the place where the journey of the dead either continued into paradise or ended in something far worse than ordinary death. It was the place where the universe looked at you and said, clearly and finally, here is what you were. And the feather, perfectly still on the scale, said the same thing in a different language. Of all the divine figures who presided over the judgment of the heart, Anubis is perhaps the most immediately recognizable and the most misunderstood. The contemporary imagination tends to encounter Anubis as a figure of menace, the black-headed jackal god associated with death, with embalming, with the underworld. In popular culture, he is often depicted as a threatening figure, as dark as his colouring suggests, as mysterious as his domain. But in the Egyptian understanding, Anubis was not threatening to the souls of the dead who had lived well. He was their guide, their protector, the being who shepherded them through the most dangerous part of their afterlife journey, who prepared them for the judgment, and who performed the weighing with scrupulous fairness. Anubis was one of the oldest gods in the Egyptian pantheon, depicted in the earliest dynastic art, associated with burial and the dead from the very beginning of the tradition we have record of. His jackal form was not chosen arbitrarily. Jackals were commonly seen in the cemeteries of ancient Egypt, the desert-edge burial grounds where the dry sand preserved bodies, the jackals sometimes disturbing the shallow graves of the early periods in search of food. To the Egyptians, the jackal's association with burial grounds was understood not as predation, but as a kind of guardianship. The jackal who frequented the cemetery was watching over the dead, patrolling the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, ensuring that the transition between the two was properly managed. Anubis's specific role in the mummification process was central. He was the divine patron of embalmers, the god who had first performed mummification on the body of Osiris, teaching the technique to the human priests who would practice it thereafter. The chief embalmer at a mummification ceremony wore a jackal-headed mask, embodying Anubis and performing the ritual in his name. The mummy was understood as resting in Anubis's arms, protected by his divine guardianship, preserved by the technique he had first demonstrated. In the weighing of the heart, Anubis's role was to conduct the ceremony, to take the heart from the dead person's body, to place it on the left side of the scale, to ensure that the scale was correctly calibrated and the weighing was performed with absolute precision. His role was procedural rather than judicial. He was not the judge, but the officer of the court, the being responsible for ensuring that the process was carried out correctly. The judgment was rendered by Osiris and ratified by Thoth. The weighing was performed by Anubis. The precision required of Anubis in this role was understood as absolute. The scale must be perfectly balanced before the heart was placed on it. The heart must be correctly positioned. The feather must be properly placed on the opposing side. Any error in the procedure would invalidate the result, and an invalidated result would be a failure of justice, a violation of Maat. Anubis's reputation for scrupulous accuracy in the weighing was therefore a guarantee of the judgment's fairness. Whatever the result, it was correct, because Anubis had ensured the precision of the measurement. Anubis was also the guide who led the dead person through the duat to reach the Hall of Two Truths in the first place. The journey through the underworld was dangerous, full of hostile forces, serpents, gates that required the correct passwords, challenges that required the correct ritual knowledge. Anubis served as the escort who knew the way, who could negotiate the challenges, who understood the underworld's geography and its dangers, and could bring the dead person safely to the hall where their fate would be decided. The relationship between Anubis and the dead was therefore one of sustained care. From the moment of death, through the preparation of the body, through the journey to the hall, through the weighing itself, he was not a figure of fear to the person who had lived well, but a figure of reassurance, the being who was on their side, who was there to ensure the process was done correctly, who would conduct them to their judgment with the dignity and the precision that a genuine accounting of a human life deserved. In the later periods of Egyptian history, as the tradition evolved, Anubis's role was sometimes shared with or taken over by other divine figures, and his specific functions were elaborated and refined, but his essential character remained consistent. The careful, precise, just God of the dead, who held the scales of judgment with steady hands and an unwavering commitment to accuracy. The heart that he placed on the scale would be weighed as fairly as it was possible to weigh anything. The result would be true, and Anubis, having performed his role with perfect precision, would record the result and present it to Osiris. The mythology surrounding Anubis's origins is complex and reflects the long history of Egyptian religious thought and the way in which different local traditions were eventually synthesized into a more coherent national theology. In the earliest period, Anubis was the preeminent funerary deity, the god of the dead, the lord of the necropolis, the divine figure primarily responsible for the protection and judgment of the dead. As the cult of Osiris grew in importance through the Old and Middle Kingdom periods, and eventually displaced Anubis as the primary ruler of the dead, Anubis was reintegrated into the mythology as a servant of Osiris, a divine figure of great importance but subsidiary to the greater king of the dead. The colour of Anubis, black, consistently depicted with black skin, even when the rest of his costume was rendered in other colours, was not associated with death in the way that black is associated with death in Western tradition. In the Egyptian colour symbolism, black was the colour of fertile soil, of the rich dark earth deposited by the Nile's annual flood, of regeneration and growth. The black of Anubis was therefore the black of the earth that received the dead and held them, the black of the fertile ground that preserved and protected what was buried in it, the black of the renewal that waited within apparent darkness. Anubis was black because he was the guardian of the transformation from death to afterlife, and that transformation was understood not as darkness, but as the kind of creative darkness in which new life is generated. The specific instrument of Anubis in the mummification ritual was the scale, but he was also associated with specific tools of the embalmer's trade, the knife that made the incision through which the organs were removed, the hook that extracted the brain, the natron that preserved the flesh. These tools were understood as sacred objects, used by the god himself in the first mummification of Osiris, and reused by human practitioners acting in his name. The care with which embalming implements were treated, often ritually disposed of after use rather than simply cleaned and reused, reflected the understanding that they were not ordinary tools, but sacred instruments whose contact with the divine was permanent. To stand before Anubis was to stand before a kind of divine justice that was not susceptible to bribery, to eloquence, to social influence, or to any of the strategies by which human beings manipulate the human systems of judgment. Anubis had no interest in the dead person's wealth or status or connections. He had one interest, the correct weight of the heart on the correct scale against the correct standard. The rest was irrelevant. The specific technique by which Anubis extracted the heart from the mummy for placement on the scale is described in some funerary texts and depicted in some vignettes with a care that reflects the theological significance of the act. The heart was not simply removed, it was received, the word used in Egyptian suggesting an act of formal acceptance rather than mere physical extraction. Anubis received the heart from the body of the deceased with the reverence appropriate to receiving a sacred object of immense significance, and his handling of it from that moment to his placement on the scale was conducted with the careful precision that the sacred instrument of the judgment deserved. The jackal's role as a boundary figure, an animal of the edges of the inhabited world, comfortable in the desert that surrounded the Nile Valley, moving between the cultivated land and the uncultivated wilderness, made it an appropriate emblem for the deity who moved between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Anubis was understood as being at home in both worlds, capable of operating in the duat in ways that the living gods were not, capable of bringing the dead through the duat in ways that the dead could not manage alone. His jackal nature was his qualification for the role. The creature of the border was the ideal guide for the journey across the most significant border of all. The 42 assessors were not, in the Egyptian understanding, hostile judges looking for reason to condemn. They were more like witnesses, divine beings, whose role was to hear the declaration of innocence and to assess its truth. The tradition was careful to distinguish between the declaration of innocence and the reality that the declaration claimed to represent. The gods could not be deceived. A declaration of innocence that did not reflect the truth of the life would not protect the person who made it. It would simply add the additional wrong of lying before the divine tribunal to the wrongs that were already inscribed on the heart. Several versions of the negative confession include declarations that address the internal life as much as external actions, declarations against harbouring resentment, against harbouring grief that had not been properly worked through, against the internal states that produced harmful actions without necessarily producing those actions themselves. This attention to the interior life, to what was felt and desired and intended as well as what was done, reflects the Egyptian understanding that the heart recorded everything, including the things that never became actions. The person who had wanted to harm someone but had refrained from doing so was not in the clear simply because no harm had been done. The wanting was in the heart, and the heart would be weighed with its contents complete. The number 42 was not arbitrary. It corresponded to the 42 nomes, the administrative districts of ancient Egypt, and the 42 assessors were understood as the divine representatives of those districts, ensuring that the judgment was comprehensive and geographically complete. No region of Egyptian life, no sphere of Egyptian social and religious obligation was outside the scope of the divine tribunal. The judgment was not partial or selective. It addressed the whole of a life lived in the whole of Egypt's social and moral landscape. To stand before Anubis was to stand before a kind of divine justice that was not susceptible to bribery, to eloquence, to social influence, or to any of the strategies by which human beings manipulate the human systems of judgment. Anubis had no interest in the dead person's wealth or status or connections. He had one interest: the correct weight of the heart on the correct scale against the correct standard. The rest was irrelevant. At the side of the scale in every depiction of the weighing of the heart, a creature waits. It crouches rather than stands, suggesting a patient, permanent readiness rather than an active threat. It is composite, made of parts of 3 different animals, rather than being a single species, in a way that makes it both recognizable and deeply wrong, both familiar in its components and disturbing in its combination. It does not look at the deceased, it looks at the scale. It is waiting to see which way the needle moves. This creature is Ammit, sometimes written Ammut or Ahimait, whose name translates roughly as the devourer of the dead, or the bone-eater, or the great swallower. She was understood as female, and her composite form combined the 3 most dangerous animals known to the ancient Egyptians: the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion or leopard, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Each of these animals was capable of killing a human being with ease. Combined in Ammit's body, they represented the concentrated killing power of the natural world in its most formidable forms. Ammit was not a goddess. This is an important distinction. The Egyptian tradition was careful about what qualified as divine, and Ammit did not meet the criteria. She was a supernatural creature, powerful and significant, but she was not worshipped, not offered to, not invoked in prayers. She had no temple, no cult, no dedicated priests. She existed for a single purpose: to devour the hearts that were found too heavy to pass the judgment. In the long taxonomy of Egyptian supernatural beings, she occupied a unique position, essential to the functioning of the divine judgment without being herself divine. The devouring of the heart was not death in the ordinary sense. This is crucial to understanding the Egyptians' view of what Ammit represented. The dead person standing in the Hall of Two Truths had already died in the physical sense. Their body was in the tomb. Their biological life was over. What Ammit threatened was something different, and, in the Egyptian understanding, far more terrible. The second death, the final death, the death from which there was no recovery. In the Egyptian conception of the soul, the continued existence of a person after death depended on the survival of the various components of the self: the heart, the ba, the ka, the akh, and on their successful reunification and continued nourishment. If the heart was devoured by Ammit, the reunification was impossible. There was no heart to anchor the self in the afterlife. There was no seat of consciousness around which the other components of the personality could gather. The person ceased to exist, not in the sense of going somewhere else, but in the absolute sense of ceasing to be. This was the second death, the death of the soul, and it was understood as the most complete annihilation imaginable. The Egyptian term for this fate was Wehemmet, the second death, or the repeated death, and it appears in the funerary texts as the thing that the dead person was most urgently trying to avoid. Not suffering, not punishment, not hell in the Christian sense of eternal conscious torment, but simple, complete, absolute non-existence. The person whose heart was devoured by Ammit was gone. There was no trace of them in the afterlife, no continuation of their consciousness, no possibility of eventual restoration. They had simply ceased to be. The psychological and theological sophistication of this concept is remarkable when set against the more familiar Western conceptions of hell and damnation. The Egyptian second death was not a punishment in the conventional sense. It was not pain inflicted as retribution for wrongdoing. It was simply the natural consequence of a life that had not maintained sufficient Maat to have weight on the cosmic scale. The heart that was too heavy was not tortured, it was consumed. The person who had failed the judgment was not sent to suffer. They were ended. The universe, having found them too disordered to admit to its ordered continuation, simply dissolved them back into the undifferentiated matter from which all things had come. The image of Ammit waiting beside the scale was, in the Egyptian tradition, both a warning and a reassurance. A warning because it made the consequences of moral failure starkly visible. The creature crouching there was not ambiguous, not frightening in an abstract way, but in a very specific and immediate way, and a reassurance because the judgment was fair, because the scale was accurate, because Anubis held it steady, and because the person who had lived by Maat had nothing to fear from Ammit. The devourer waited for the guilty. The just had no reason to look at her. The composite nature of Ammit, the crocodile head, the lion or leopard forequarters, the hippopotamus hindquarters, was not random but carefully chosen from the animals the Egyptians considered most dangerous and most powerful. Each component represented a specific kind of consuming power. The crocodile was the animal that seized from below, that pulled its prey beneath the water and held it there until it drowned, the power of sudden seizure from the depths. The lion was the animal that pursued from behind, that ran down its prey in the open desert, the power of relentless pursuit. The hippopotamus was the animal that charged from the water, that could overturn boats and crush humans with its enormous bulk, the power of overwhelming force. Together, Ammit combined all the ways that an animal could kill a human being into a single composite creature of maximal consuming power. The question of whether Ammit was ever propitiated, whether offerings were made to her to appease or deflect her attention, is interesting, and the answer appears to be no. Unlike virtually every other supernatural figure in the Egyptian pantheon, Ammit had no cult, no temple, no dedicated worshippers seeking her favour. She was not a being whose goodwill could be cultivated. She was not a being whose anger could be appeased. She was not a personality at all, in the religious sense, but a function, the function of consuming what was too heavy to pass. There was nothing personal in what she did, no malice, no pleasure in destruction. She was simply what happened to the hearts that failed the test. The visual consistency of Ammit's depiction across different periods and different regional traditions of Egyptian art is remarkable. While many Egyptian divine figures showed significant variation in their iconographic presentation, depending on the period and the specific artistic tradition, Ammit remained essentially constant. The composite form, the crouching posture, the position beside the scale, the alertness of the waiting creature, this consistency suggests that Ammit's image was considered particularly important to get right, that the specific combination of animals and the specific posture of waiting were understood as essential to what she meant, not merely decorative. Ammit was the universe's response to wrongdoing, not anger, not revenge, but dissolution. The heart too heavy to fly was the heart too disordered to continue, and the creature that received it was not cruel, not malicious, not sadistic. She was simply what happened when the balance was not achieved. She was, in the most literal sense, the weight of consequences. The specific Egyptian term for the second death, Weh-Hemet, appears in the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead as one of the greatest dangers the dead person faced, a fate explicitly worse than the ordinary death that everyone experienced. The spells of the funerary corpus were oriented, in significant part, toward the avoidance of the second death, not merely toward reaching the field of reeds, but toward ensuring that the heart would not be devoured by Ammit on the way there. The second death was the catastrophic failure of the afterlife project, the outcome that all the mummification, all the funerary goods, all the spells and rituals and moral preparation were designed to prevent. The comparison between Ammit's second death and the Christian concept of hell is instructive for what it reveals about different religious responses to the problem of ultimate moral accountability. Christianity, at least in its predominant Western forms, developed the concept of eternal conscious punishment, the wicked soul experiencing suffering without end, the pain of hell, serving as both retribution for earthly wrongdoing and deterrent to future wrongdoing among the living. The Egyptian second death was not punishment but dissolution. The wicked heart was not tormented but simply ceased to exist. This difference reflects a different understanding of what the universe owed to moral failure, not retribution, but simply the natural consequence of having been too disordered to continue. The role of Horus in the judgment scene is often overlooked in favour of the more dramatically visible roles of Anubis and Thoth. But Horus was consistently present in the canonical depictions of the weighing. He is typically shown leading the newly vindicated soul into the presence of Osiris after a successful judgment, the guide who conducted the dead person from the moment of vindication to the final reception by the king of the dead. Horus's role as conductor of the vindicated was continuous with his broader mythological role as the righteous heir, the one who had fought to establish justice after the murder of his father Osiris. His presence in the judgment hall was a reminder that the whole system of divine justice that the hall embodied had been established through struggle, through the cosmic conflict between Horus and Set that had established the principle of righteous succession against the principle of violent usurpation. The participation of the BA, the individual soul, in witnessing its own judgment has implications for how we understand Egyptian afterlife belief that are worth dwelling on. The BA was not a passive observer. In some textual traditions, the BA could speak, could advocate for its owner, could provide testimony of its own. The BA's perspective on the life that had been lived was the perspective of the person who had lived it from the inside, the perspective of subjective experience as distinct from the objective record inscribed on the heart. Whether the BA's testimony could outweigh the heart's record was a question the tradition did not entirely resolve, but the BA's presence in the hall was itself a statement that the deceased was not merely an object being assessed, but a subject participating in the assessment of their own life. The role of the divine witnesses in the hall extended beyond simple observation. Each divine being present was understood as contributing to the authority and the completeness of the judgment. Their collective presence was what made the verdict final and unappealable. A judgment witnessed by a single divine being might have been questioned or challenged. A judgment witnessed by the full assembly of heaven was beyond any possible appeal. The Hall of Two Truths was therefore designed not merely for accuracy, but for authority. The verdict it produced was one that the entire divine world had observed and endorsed, a verdict that couldn't be undone by any subsequent pleading or any subsequently discovered evidence. Ammit was the universe's response to wrongdoing, not anger, not revenge, but dissolution. The heart too heavy to fly was the heart too disordered to continue, and the creature that received it was not cruel, not malicious, not sadistic. She was simply what happened when the balance was not achieved. She was, in the most literal sense, the weight of consequences. Before the heart was placed on the scale, the dead person had to speak. They had to speak at considerable length in a specific form to a specific audience of 42 divine judges, each of whom represented a different nome of Egypt and a different category of moral failure. The speech they were required to make is known to Egyptologists as the negative confession, a list of declarations, each asserting that the deceased had not committed a specific wrong. It was not a confession in the sense of admitting guilt. It was a declaration of innocence, a formal, ritual assertion that the person standing before the judges had not violated the moral order in the specific ways that the 42 judges were charged with assessing. The negative confession appears in its fullest form in chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, and it is one of the most extraordinary moral documents in the history of human thought. Its length, its specificity, and the range of moral concerns it addresses give a remarkably complete picture of what the Egyptians considered to constitute right living, what a morally complete person looked like, what obligations they fulfilled, what harms they refrained from inflicting. The declarations begin with the most fundamental moral violations and proceed through an increasingly specific catalogue of wrongdoing. I have not committed sin, the deceased declared. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men or women. I have not stolen grain. I have not purloined offerings. I have not stolen the property of God. I have not uttered lies. I have not carried away food. I have not uttered curses. I have not committed adultery. I have not made any man to weep. I have not eaten the heart, a phrase that meant something like acting against one's own conscience, being false to oneself. I have not attacked any man. I'm not a man of deceit. The list continues through dozens of declarations, each addressed to a specific judge identified by name. I have done no wrong to men, O swallower of shadows. I have not told lies, O bringer of truth. I have not robbed the poor, O Lord of the two eyes. I haven't made anyone to suffer, O destroyer of snakes. The specificity of the address, the naming of each judge, the specific category of their concern, reflected the Egyptian understanding of the judgment as a genuine legal proceeding governed by procedure conducted before a complete and representative tribunal. Several of the declarations in the negative confession address social and economic justice in ways that are striking for their specificity and their moral seriousness. I have not encroached upon the fields. I have not added to the weights of the scale. I have not falsified the plummet of the balance. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. I have not driven away the cattle from their pastures. I have not snared the birds in the marshes of the gods. These were not abstract moral principles. They were specific violations of specific people's specific rights. The encroachment on a neighbour's field, the cheating of customers through false weights, the theft of children's food. The moral universe of the negative confession was a universe of concrete relationships and concrete obligations, not merely of abstract virtues. The confession also addressed ritual obligations, the proper performance of religious duties, the correct treatment of sacred objects and sacred spaces. I have not done that which the gods abominate. I have not vilified a slave to his master. I have not caused pain. I have not caused weeping. I have not acted guilefully. I have not acted insolently. I have not consumed the sacred food. I have not polluted myself. I have not added to or diminished the measure. The ritual and the ethical were not separated in the Egyptian moral understanding. The failure to perform the correct ritual was as much a moral failure as the commission of a social harm. What is perhaps most striking about the negative confession, to a reader coming from a modern Western background, is the absence of interior states from the central list. The confession was not primarily about what you had felt or thought or desired. It was about what you had done and what you had refrained from doing. The moral accounting was largely an accounting of actions, of the effects of a person's life on other people and on the divine order, rather than an accounting of internal states of mind. This is not to say that the Egyptians had no interest in intention and inner life. They did, but the primary moral currency of the negative confession was behavior, consequence, and relationship. The recitation of the negative confession was understood as more than a simple assertion of innocence. It was a ritual act, a speech act in the strong sense, a performance that participated in the creation of the reality it described. The person who declared, "I have not lied before the judge," whose concern was truthfulness, was not simply making a factual claim. They were participating in the ritual establishment of their moral identity, performing their truthfulness in the act of speaking truthfully about their truthfulness. The declaration and the reality it described were not entirely separate things. The practical preparation for the negative confession, the memorization of the 42 declarations, the learning of the 42 judges' names, the correct form of address for each, was part of the funerary preparation that the Book of the Dead was designed to provide. The deceased, who had been buried with a good copy of the Book of the Dead, whose family had paid for the proper spells to be written on the papyrus, was a deceased who was prepared for the judgment in a way that the unprepared were not. The ritual preparation was understood as genuinely helpful, not as a substitute for moral living, but as a necessary complement to it. The 42 judges of the negative confession were understood as a jury of the whole of Egypt, each judge associated with a specific nome or administrative district, their presence ensuring that no region of the country, no category of the population, no type of social relationship was left unrepresented in the judgment. The comprehensiveness of the tribunal was a statement about the comprehensiveness of the moral accounting. Every person who might have been wronged was represented in the hall. Every category of harm was assessed. Every dimension of the social world was examined. The judgment was not partial or selective, it was complete. The specific names of the 42 judges in the negative confession are poetic and often striking. Among them were Swallower of Shadows, Breaker of Bones, Eater of Blood, Shining Tooth, Embracer of Fire, One Who Comes at Night, Double Evil, White Teeth, Eater of Entrails, Face Behind, Serpent Who Brings Evil, Giver of Breath, Eater of Heads. Each name encapsulated something about the specific wrongdoing the judge was concerned with. The Breaker of Bones was concerned with violence against others, the White Teeth with the clean truth of honest speech. The One Who Comes at Night with wrongdoing performed under the cover of darkness when witnesses were absent. The names were not just labels, but moral descriptions of the qualities the judges embodied. The preparation of the average Egyptian for the negative confession was not primarily the product of individual study of the Book of the Dead's texts. It was the product of a lifetime of cultural formation within a society that took Maat seriously, that enacted the values of the negative confession in its daily life, that told stories about the judgment and its consequences, that performed rituals that connected everyday actions to the cosmic accounting. The negative confession was the formal articulation of what a person of Maat was, and the person of Maat was the person the entire culture was working to produce from childhood onward. The 42 declarations of innocence were, in the end, an extraordinary exercise in moral self-examination. To consider each one, to ask yourself honestly whether you had committed each of the wrongs listed, was to measure your life against a comprehensive moral standard, to see where you had fallen short, to understand the shape of the ideal life that the tradition was describing. The negative confession was not only a text for the dead, it was, for the living, a guide to what living well looked like. The social context in which the negative confession was memorized and practiced illuminates the role of the Egyptian temple in the moral formation of the individual. The great temples of ancient Egypt, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and dozens of others, were not simply places of worship in the sense of being spaces where individuals came to pray. They were institutions that maintained the ritual performances on which the cosmic order depended, employed large numbers of priests and other temple personnel, and served as economic and intellectual centers for their communities. The moral teaching that the negative confession encoded was transmitted partly through the temple institution, through the ritual performances that enacted the values of Maat, through the wisdom literature that the temple schools produced and transmitted. The relationship between the negative confession and the 10 Commandments of the biblical tradition has been a subject of comparative religious study since scholars first noticed the structural parallels. Both documents list specific moral prohibitions that a person of genuine righteousness would observe. Both use the negative form, I have not, thou shalt not, to define the boundaries of the moral life. Both are presented in a formal, quasi-legal register that suggests a genuine accounting rather than merely aspirational advice. The parallels are close enough to have generated serious scholarly debate about the degree of direct influence, with the negative confession predating the 10 Commandments by many centuries, and the documented contact between Egyptian and Israelite cultures providing a plausible channel of transmission. The moment-by-moment experience of the soul that had failed the judgment, the soul whose heart was heavier than the feather, is described in the Egyptian texts with some care, and what is described is not the dramatic punishment of later traditions, but something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. The soul that had been found wanting was not immediately attacked or seized. It stood in the hall, having heard the scales settle against it, and it knew. The knowing was part of the consequence, the full, clear, unavoidable knowledge that the life had not been what it should have been, that the heart carried more than Maat could balance, that the path forward was not the field of reeds. The texts describe Ammit as waiting at the edge of the hall, not positioned at the scales themselves, but nearby, present, patient. She had been there for every judgment. She would be there for every judgment yet to come. Her presence was understood as necessary as part of what made the judgment system work, but her role was contingent. She waited for the hearts that were brought to her. Most judgments, the tradition implied, did not bring her work. Most people who arrived at the hall with proper preparation and a reasonably well-lived life were found worthy. Ammit's appetite was real, but it was not insatiable, and the tradition did not suggest that the majority of the dead were destined for her. The 42 declarations of innocence were, in the end, an extraordinary exercise in moral self-examination. To consider each one to ask yourself, honestly, whether you had committed each of the wrongs listed, was to measure your life against a comprehensive moral standard, to see where you had fallen short, to understand the shape of the ideal life that the tradition was describing. The negative confession was not only a text for the dead, it was, for the living, a guide to what living well looked like. No Egyptian who could afford it faced the weighing of the heart unprepared. The preparation took many forms: the mummification that preserved the body, the funerary goods that provided for the afterlife, the rituals performed at the tomb. But the most comprehensive and most directly relevant preparation was the Book of the Dead, or rather the corpus of texts that Egyptologists call the Book of the Dead, known to the Egyptians themselves as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the Reu nu Pert Emhru, the collection of spells and instructions that a dead person needed to navigate the afterlife successfully. The Book of the Dead was not a single fixed text with a canonical form. It was a collection of spells, over 200 in the most complete versions, that varied in their selection, their arrangement, and their specific wording across different periods, different regions, and different individual copies. Different copies of the Book of the Dead included different spells, arranged in different orders, with different accompanying illustrations. The spells could be inscribed on papyrus rolls placed in the coffin, on the coffin walls, on the walls of the tomb, on specific funerary objects. The ideal was to have all the spells you might need available in appropriate form, but in practice most people had whatever their family could afford to commission. The Book of the Dead was the culmination of a long tradition of funerary texts that stretched back to the Old Kingdom, more than 4,000 years ago. The earliest versions of this tradition, the pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of royal pyramids beginning in the 5th dynasty around 2400 BCE, were exclusively available to royalty. The Middle Kingdom coffin texts, inscribed on coffins rather than pyramid walls, made similar material available to the non-royal elite. The New Kingdom Book of the Dead, written on papyrus and available to anyone who could pay for a copy, democratized the afterlife preparation that had previously been a royal privilege. This democratization was itself a significant development in Egyptian religious history. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh was certain to achieve a glorious afterlife. Ordinary people might hope for some continued existence, but could not be confident of it. By the New Kingdom, any person who had lived righteously and been properly buried could aspire to the field of reeds. The Book of the Dead was the instrument of this democratization, the text that made the map of the afterlife journey and the spells necessary for navigating it available to ordinary Egyptians rather than only to kings. Chapter 1. 125 of the Book of the Dead, which contains the weighing of the heart vignette and the negative confession, was one of the most consistently included chapters across the tradition, one of the spells that copyists rarely left out, regardless of which other spells they chose to include or exclude. The importance of this chapter reflected the centrality of the judgment to the afterlife theology. Whatever other challenges the dead person might face on their journey through the duat, the weighing of the heart was the decisive moment, the test that all other preparations were ultimately in service of. The accompanying vignette, the visual illustration of the weighing scene, was among the most carefully executed images in any Book of the Dead. The scribes who produced these documents were skilled artists as well as copyists, and the weighing scene was a showpiece rendered with care and detail. The scale, the heart, the feather, the divine figures in attendance, Ammit crouching patiently at the side, all of these were depicted clearly and with the specific iconographic conventions that identified each figure and their role. The image was not merely decorative, it was instructional, showing the dead person what they were about to face and who they would meet. The Egyptian tradition's answer appears to have been both. The book was genuinely necessary for the afterlife journey, providing knowledge and protective spells without which the journey would be much more dangerous. But the book was not a substitute for moral living, because the heart that it was trying to present favourably was still the actual heart, still the actual record of the actual life, still the thing that would be placed on the scale and weighed against the actual feather. The spells could smooth the presentation, could quieten the heart's most damning testimony, could arm the deceased with the right words for each challenge, but they could not change the weight of the heart. Only the life itself could change that. The Book of the Dead was, in the most generous interpretation, a support for the genuinely righteous, a practical guide that helped good people navigate a dangerous journey, that compensated for the ignorance about afterlife procedure that was no fault of the good person's moral character. In the less generous interpretation, it was a product of commercial religious culture, sold to those who could afford it with promises that it could not entirely keep. The tradition held both possibilities, as all living religious traditions hold the tension between genuine piety and commercial opportunism, and it is not our place to resolve a tension that the Egyptians themselves never resolved. The production of books of the dead in ancient Egypt was a significant industry, with workshops of scribes and artists specializing in the production of these documents for wealthy clients. The quality of the product varied enormously depending on the client's budget. The most expensive copies were produced on the finest papyrus with high-quality pigments and careful detailed illustrations by skilled artists. Cheaper versions were produced on lower-quality materials with less careful illustration, or even as pre-written template texts with spaces left blank for the insertion of the specific dead person's name. The existence of these template texts, what we might call off-the-shelf books of the dead, tells us something important about the commercialization of the afterlife preparation industry and about the degree to which access to the judgment was understood as a matter of economic, as well as moral preparation. The survival of books of the dead in such large numbers, the Egyptian collection alone in the British Museum holds hundreds of examples, has given Egyptologists an extraordinary window into Egyptian religious thought across more than a millennium of continuous tradition. The variations between copies, the choices that different scribes and clients made about which spells to include and which to omit, the way the vignettes developed and changed across different periods, all of these tell us about the living evolution of the tradition, about which aspects were considered most important, about how the belief in the judgment developed and changed over time. The role of the scribe in Egyptian society was directly connected to the afterlife ideology through the figure of Thoth, the divine scribe who recorded the judgment. The human scribe who copied the Book of the Dead was, in a sense, participating in the divine recording function that Thoth himself performed, making the text that would enable the dead person's judgment, preparing the record that would accompany them through the duat. The scribe's work was therefore not merely commercial or artistic, but sacred, a participation in the divine act of keeping the record that the judgment required. What the Book of the Dead unquestionably was, regardless of its commercial dimensions, was a remarkable document of Egyptian thought about the afterlife, about justice, about the soul, and about what a human life owed to the divine order. Its spells were not arbitrary. Its geography was not random. Its judgments reflected genuine moral thinking. Whatever use was made of it by the unscrupulous, the text itself was a serious attempt to describe what the universe required of a human being and what a human being could hope for in return. The market for books of the dead in ancient Egypt was served by scribal workshops that maintained template texts, standard versions of the most important spells produced in advance and stored until a client's purchase required that the client's name be inserted into the blanks left for this purpose. Several surviving books of the dead show evidence of this template production. The client's name has been added in a slightly different hand from the main text, or the name has been added in red pigment over a space left in the original black inscription, or the name has simply been left out entirely because the commission was not completed before it was needed. These variations tell us that the production of Books of the Dead was a genuine commercial enterprise, subject to the same pressures and shortcuts that any commercial enterprise experiences. The literacy required to produce a Book of the Dead was itself a marker of elite status in ancient Egypt, and the relationship between literacy, wealth, and access to the afterlife was one of the structuring realities of Egyptian society. The person who could read and write had access to the texts that the tradition held were necessary for navigating the Duat. The person who could not read and write, the majority of the Egyptian population, was dependent on others for access to those texts, and the quality of the afterlife preparation they received was therefore directly dependent on the resources they could bring to bear on commissioning the necessary work. The Book of the Dead was, among other things, a document of class and power in the afterlife. The Field of Reeds, the Seket Aru, the Egyptian paradise that awaited those whose hearts, balanced against the feather, deserves more description than it typically receives in accounts focused on the judgment. It was understood not as a static state of bliss, but as a continuation of the best aspects of Egyptian life: fields that were always fertile, harvests that were always abundant, the company of the gods and of beloved ancestors who had gone before, the continuation of the activities and relationships that had given life its meaning. The dead in the Field of Reeds were depicted in art as doing the same things the living did: farming, celebrating, enjoying the company of their families, but without the hardships of the living world. The specific activities depicted in the Field of Reeds included work, farming, harvesting, the ordinary agricultural labour of the Egyptian countryside, but the work was not burdensome. The soil was always receptive, the crops always bountiful, the effort always rewarded. The Shabti, the small figurines placed in tombs in large numbers, were intended to serve as workers in the Field of Reeds, substitutes who would do the harder agricultural work on behalf of the deceased. The wealthy tomb might contain hundreds of Shabtis, one for each day of the year, ensuring that the deceased would not be required to do more than oversee the work of their divine workforce. The Field of Reeds was understood as paradise, but it was Egyptian paradise, a paradise that valued the activities of this world and continued them under ideal conditions. What the Book of the Dead unquestionably was, regardless of its commercial dimensions, was a remarkable document of Egyptian thought about the afterlife, about justice, about the soul, and about what a human life owed to the divine order. Its spells were not arbitrary, its geography was not random, its judgments reflected genuine moral thinking. Whatever use was made of it by the unscrupulous, the text itself was a serious attempt to describe what the universe required of a human being and what a human being could hope for in return. The weighing of the heart was not only a doctrine about the afterlife, it was a doctrine that reached backward into life, shaping behavior, motivating ethics, creating a moral framework that was grounded in the understanding that everything you did was being recorded and would eventually be weighed. The practical ethics of Egyptian daily life were shaped by the concept of Maat in ways that are visible across every category of source material. The wisdom literature, the legal texts, the inscriptions on tomb walls in which the deceased describe their lives, the letters between ordinary people that have survived in archaeological contexts. Maat was not merely a theological abstraction, but a lived orientation, a way of approaching daily decisions, daily relationships, daily obligations that was informed by the understanding that the heart was keeping score. The Egyptian wisdom literature, the collections of practical advice and moral instruction that were produced across the entirety of Egyptian history, is one of the richest sources for understanding how Maat operated as an ethical framework in daily life. The instructions of Ptah-hotep, one of the oldest pieces of Egyptian wisdom literature, dating to the Old Kingdom period, offered advice on how to conduct oneself in relation to superiors, equals, and inferiors in ways that are recognizably Maat-oriented. Give generously, speak honestly, treat the poor with respect, do not oppress those beneath you, be humble before those above you. The virtues recommended by Ptah-hotep were the virtues of the person who expected to face the judgment, the person who was living with the awareness that the heart recorded everything. The tomb inscriptions of Egyptian officials and nobles from the Old Kingdom onwards frequently include what Egyptologists call the ideal autobiographies, texts in which the deceased describe their lives in terms calculated to demonstrate their fitness for the afterlife. These texts are not objective biographical records. They are carefully crafted presentations of the deceased's moral credentials, designed to establish their claim to a positive judgment. What is striking about them is not their self-serving quality, which is obvious, but the specific virtues they emphasize: generosity to the poor, honest dealing in business, fair judgment in disputes, care for the elderly, provision for the widow and orphan. One of the most frequently cited of these ideal autobiographies comes from the tomb of Harkuf, a high official of the 6th dynasty who served under several pharaohs as an expedition leader. He described himself as one who gave bread to the hungry, clothing to the naked, who ferried him who had no boat, who was one praised of his father, whom his mother praised, whom all of his brothers loved. This was not simply self-promotion. It was a moral curriculum, a description of what the ideal Egyptian life looked like, articulated in terms that the judgment would recognize as meritorious. Harkuf was, in effect, reciting a version of the negative confession in positive form. Not I have not failed, but here is what I have done that was good. The social justice dimensions of the Maat ethic were particularly significant for those in positions of authority. Judges, administrators, officials of all kinds were understood to bear a specific responsibility to maintain Maat in their exercise of power, to judge fairly, to administer honestly, to protect the vulnerable against the powerful. The failure of an official to maintain Maat was not merely a professional failure, but a moral and spiritual one, a violation of the cosmic order that would be weighed against the official's heart at the judgment. The instructions for Merikar, a Middle Kingdom text in which a king advised his son on the proper conduct of kingship, contains a passage of remarkable moral directedness about the judgment. Do justice whilst thou endurest upon earth. Quieten the weeper, do not oppress the widow. Supplant no man in the property of his father, and impair no officials at their posts. Be on thy guard against punishing wrongfully. Do not slaughter, it is not of advantage to thee. But thou shouldst punish with beatings and with imprisonments, thus the land will be established. The advice was practical and political as well as moral, but the moral framework underlying it was unmistakable. Justice was the obligation of the powerful, and the judgment awaited everyone. The agricultural and commercial ethics encoded in the Maat framework were also significant. The false measure, the fraudulent weight, the encroachment on a neighbour's field, these were not merely civil wrongs subject to legal remedy. They were violations of Maat, disruptions of the proper order of things, additions to the weight of the heart that would eventually be brought to the scale. The merchant who cheated customers with a false balance was creating a specific and retrievable record of wrongdoing in their own heart. The official who extorted bribes was inscribing each bribe on the organ that would eventually be weighed. The awareness of this cosmic accounting was intended to operate as a deterrent, not merely the fear of human punishment, but the certainty of divine judgment. The concept of Maat also shaped Egyptian attitudes toward truth-telling in a way that is directly relevant to the negative confession. Truthfulness was not simply a social virtue for the Egyptians, it was a participation in the cosmic order. To speak truthfully was to align oneself with Maat, to contribute to the fabric of reality rather than to distort it. To lie was to violate the cosmic order in a direct and personal way, to introduce Isfet into the world through the medium of one's own mouth. The declaration, "I have not lied," in the negative confession was therefore not merely a denial of a specific wrongdoing, but an assertion of one's fundamental alignment with the universe's basic requirement for truthful speech. The specific ethical requirement of honesty in Egyptian daily life, grounded in the Maat framework, is visible in the extensive surviving legal documentation from ancient Egypt. The Egyptian legal system was sophisticated and well documented, and the papyri and ostraca that record legal proceedings give a picture of a society that took truthfulness in legal contexts very seriously. The oath was a solemn matter, calling on the great gods and the pharaoh as witnesses to the truth of what was sworn, and the breaking of such an oath was understood as a serious spiritual transgression, as well as a legal one. The judge who heard false testimony, the witness who swore falsely, the plaintiff who fabricated their case, all of these were not merely committing legal wrongs, but adding specific, retrievable violations to the record that their hearts were keeping. The concept of the ideal biography, the practice of inscribing on tomb walls a description of the deceased's life that emphasized their Maat-aligned qualities, was itself a form of moral insurance. By inscribing the ideal life on the walls of the tomb, the deceased was creating a public statement of the moral character they claimed, one that could be read by visitors to the tomb and by the divine judges of the afterlife. The text was both a memorial and a deposition, a formal statement of the character the deceased asserted, against which the heart's actual record would eventually be weighed. The ideal biography was not intended as a deception. It was intended as the most favourable but essentially accurate account of a life genuinely lived in accordance with Maat. The treatment of strangers and foreigners in the Egyptian Maat ethics is an interesting dimension that the negative confession addresses directly. Several of the declarations in the negative confession specifically concern the proper treatment of people outside the immediate community, the stranger, the person far from home, the traveller who needed assistance. The Egyptian understanding of Maat encompassed obligations to people beyond the immediate social circle, reflecting the understanding that the cosmic order was not merely local but universal, and that justice toward those beyond one's community was as much a part of Maat as justice toward those within it. The Maat ethic in daily life was, ultimately, the judgment brought forward into the present, the awareness of the future weighing made active in every moment of the living day. Every decision was a decision that would be recorded. Every relationship was a relationship whose character would be assessed. Every use of power was a use that would be measured against the standard of the feather. The scale was not only in the hall of two truths. In the Egyptian understanding, the scale was always present, invisible, patient, perfectly accurate, recording the weight of every act in the organ that would eventually be placed on its pan. The Egyptian understanding of the relationship between wealth and Maat is more nuanced than a simple equation of prosperity with virtue or poverty with sin. The wealthy person was not understood as inherently more virtuous than the poor person. Indeed, the wisdom literature repeatedly warned the powerful against the temptations that power created, and the negative confession's specific concern with economic justice, the false weight, the encroached field, reflected the understanding that the wealthy were specifically tempted to violations that the poor were not in a position to commit. The moral accounting was, in this sense, calibrated to the specific temptations that each person's situation created. The wealthy were judged on their use of wealth, the powerful on their use of power. The autobiographical inscriptions from the tombs of Egyptian provincial officials from the first intermediate period, the period of political fragmentation between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, provide some of the most direct accounts of Maat-oriented behaviour in crisis conditions. Officials of this period frequently inscribed accounts of their response to famine and political instability that emphasized their care for their communities. I gave bread to the hungry in years of famine. I gave clothing to the naked. I carried in my arms those who had no boat. These inscriptions were not merely self-serving. They were genuine moral claims made in the only context in which they could be definitively assessed. Their frequency and their specificity suggest that the Maat ethic was not merely a philosophical ideal, but a practical guide that shaped behaviour even in the most difficult circumstances. The influence of the Egyptian heart judgment on later religious traditions extended beyond the obvious connections to Christian heaven and hell, and to the Islamic Day of Judgment. The Jewish concept of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, contains elements that are structurally parallel to the Egyptian judgment, the annual examination of the soul's record, the possibility of having wrongs forgiven through genuine repentance, the divine weighing of the soul's actions. The Jewish tradition developed its own distinctive theology around these themes, but the structural parallels with the Egyptian tradition, which the ancient Israelites would have encountered directly through their time in Egypt and through sustained contact with Egyptian culture, suggests that the Egyptian belief may have contributed to the form in which the later tradition expressed its own concerns. The Greek tradition's concept of the Elysian fields and the Isles of the Blessed, paradise regions of the underworld, reserved for those who had lived well and been judged favourably, is also clearly related to the Egyptian field of reeds. The Greek underworld tradition, like the Egyptian one, included a judgment of the dead conducted by divine judges. The Greek judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, performed a function structurally similar to Anubis and Thoth, assessing the merits of the dead and directing them to the appropriate region of the underworld. The Greek tradition did not use the specific imagery of the scales and the feather, but the underlying logic that death involved a judgment of the life and that the outcome of the judgment determined the nature of the afterlife was identical. The Maat ethic in daily life was, ultimately, the judgment brought forward into the present, the awareness of the future weighing made active in every moment of the living day. Every decision was a decision that would be recorded. Every relationship was a relationship whose character would be assessed. Every use of power was a use that would be measured against the standard of the feather. The scale was not only in the hall of two truths. In the Egyptian understanding, the scale was always present, invisible, patient, perfectly accurate, recording the weight of every act in the organ that would eventually be placed on his pan. We have spent this journey looking at what happened if your heart was too heavy. It is time to look at what happened if it was not, if the needle of the scale held steady, if the feather and the heart balanced, if Thoth's pen recorded the verdict of justified. The field of reeds, Aru in Egyptian, the field of rushes or the field of offerings, was the Egyptian paradise, the destination of the soul that had passed the judgment and been declared a person of truth. It was not a vague or abstractly described realm. The Egyptian tradition described it in specific, concrete, agricultural terms that reflected the Egyptian experience of what the good life looked like. Fertile land, abundant water, grain that grew to extraordinary heights, the company of loved ones, work that was satisfying rather than exhausting, existence that continued in the company of the gods. The imagery of the field of reeds reflects the Egyptian understanding of what paradise would need to be for it to genuinely constitute a reward. For a people whose entire civilization depended on the annual flooding of the Nile and the fertility it produced, whose calendar was organized around the agricultural cycle, whose prosperity was measured in grain and cattle and the productivity of the land, paradise was naturally imagined as the perfected version of the agricultural life. The same rhythms of planting and harvest and cattle tending, but without the uncertainties, the failures, the droughts and floods and plagues that made the earthly version of this life so precarious. The field of reeds was located in the eastern part of the sky, the direction of the rising sun, the direction associated with rebirth, renewal, and the beginning of things. The soul that entered the field of reeds was understood as being reborn, in a sense, entering a new mode of existence that was continuous with the earthly life, but freed from the constraints and vulnerabilities that made earthly life finite. The sun rose in the east each morning, and the soul of the justified dead rose with it, not as the sun itself, but in company with the sun, participating in the daily renewal of the world. The papyrus illustrations of the field of reeds in the New Kingdom books of the dead show a landscape that is simultaneously recognizably Egyptian and ideally perfect. Waterways running in straight channels, grain fields of impossible height, figures engaged in the familiar activities of Egyptian agricultural life, ploughing, reaping, working with cattle, but in an environment of perfect order and perfect abundance. The same activities that constituted the earthly Egyptian life constituted the afterlife in the field of reeds, but without the anxiety, without the scarcity, without the mortality that shadowed every earthly pleasure. The companions in the field of reeds were, in the Egyptian understanding, the people the deceased had loved in life, the family members who had died before, the friends whose company had been valued, the beloved dead who were waiting in the paradise for the arrival of those who had been left behind. This was not a vague collective heaven, but a specific personal reunion. The justified heart arriving at a place where specific individuals were waiting, where specific relationships could be resumed, where the bonds of love and friendship that death had interrupted could be restored. The gods were also present in the field of reeds, specifically the solar deities associated with the daily journey of the sun, whose company the justified dead could share. The Egyptians did not typically imagine themselves becoming gods. The distinction between human and divine was maintained even in paradise, but they could be in the presence of the gods, could participate in the divine order at a level that the earthly life did not allow. The justified heart was welcomed into the divine community, not as an equal, but as a member in good standing, a person whose life had been found worthy of divine company. The work that the justified dead performed in the field of reeds was real work. The same agricultural labour that had characterized Egyptian life, but it was understood as freely and joyfully performed rather than as an obligation of survival. The grain grew whether or not it was planted. The cattle prospered whether or not they were managed. The work of the field of reeds was work for the love of work, participation in the productive cycle of the universe as an act of devotion rather than necessity. This was perhaps the most profound expression of the Egyptian ideal, that the life lived in alignment with Maat was a life in which duty and pleasure were not opposed but identical. The Ushabti figures, the small servant figurines buried with the Egyptian dead in large numbers, reflect the Egyptian awareness that even paradise might involve work, and the Egyptian desire to be prepared for that possibility. The Ushabtis were magical servants who would perform any agricultural labour that the gods might require of the deceased in the field of reeds, so that the justified heart could focus on the more pleasurable aspects of the afterlife existence. The existence of the Ushabtis suggests that the field of reeds was imagined as a real place with real requirements, not simply a metaphor for blissful rest. The specific activities depicted in the field of reeds, the ploughing, the reaping, the work with cattle, reflected the Egyptian understanding that meaningful existence required productive activity, that a paradise of pure rest without purpose would not actually constitute a paradise for people who found their identity in the productive engagement with the land. The field of reeds was not a place of passive enjoyment, but of active participation in the ongoing life of a perfected world. This active quality distinguished the Egyptian paradise from some other ancient conceptions of the afterlife, which imagined the dead as shadows of themselves, pale and purposeless, in a dim underworld existence. The availability of the field of reeds was not unlimited in the earliest periods of Egyptian history. The Old Kingdom sources suggest that the glorious afterlife, the destination of the sun god's company, the place of continued conscious and active existence, was originally understood as exclusively available to the pharaoh and perhaps to members of the royal family. Ordinary Egyptians might hope for some continued existence, but the field of reeds in its fullest sense was a royal privilege. The democratization of the afterlife that occurred across the Middle Kingdom period, during which the idea that any righteous person could aspire to the full afterlife experience became increasingly established, was one of the most significant developments in Egyptian religious history. The connection between the field of reeds and the concept of the khu, the glorified transfigured spirit that the successful dead became, illuminates the transformation that the judgment was understood to enable. The khu was not simply the dead person continued, it was the dead person perfected, glorified, freed from the limitations that the earthly body had imposed on the soul's full expression. The judgment was the gatekeeping function that determined who was eligible for this transformation, who had lived a life of sufficient Maat, that the cosmic order could accommodate their transfiguration and their admission to the divine community. The field of reeds was the landscape in which the khu existed. The judgment was what made the khu possible. The field of reeds was, ultimately, the Egyptian answer to the question that all moral frameworks must eventually address: what is virtue for? If the person who lives by Maat, who speaks truthfully, who treats others with justice and compassion, who maintains the proper relationships with the gods and with other people, if that person dies in the same way as the unjust person, if there is no visible distinction in the world between the just and the unjust, then what is the point of Maat? The field of reeds was the answer. The distinction was invisible in the earthly life because the accounting was conducted elsewhere, after death, in the hall of two truths. The just person and the unjust person both died, but only one of them continued. The relationship between the field of reeds and the living world was maintained through specific ritual practices that the family of the deceased was expected to perform on behalf of the justified dead. Offerings of food, of water, of incense, of linen, the necessities of existence, were brought to the tomb on specific calendrical occasions and were understood as reaching the justified dead in their afterlife existence. The justified dead, in turn, were understood as capable of responding to these offerings, of being present in some sense at the tomb when the offerings were made, of remaining in relationship with the family that was maintaining their afterlife through the continued provision of what they needed. The field of reeds was therefore not a closed realm, separated from the living world by an unbridgeable gap. but a parallel world in communication with the living through the specific channels that ritual opened. The Egyptian conception of time and its relationship to the afterlife is relevant to understanding the field of reeds. The Egyptian language had specific terms for different qualities of time. Jet, the cyclical time of the recurring natural world, the time of the seasons and the flood and the agricultural year, and Nehe, the eternal time of the divine world, the time that did not recur, but simply continued without end. The field of reeds existed in Nehe, in the eternal time of the gods, while the living world existed primarily in Jet. The justified dead entered Nehe at the moment of their admission to the field of reeds, and this transition from cyclical time to eternal time was part of what distinguished the afterlife existence from the earthly one. The democratization of the afterlife belief in Egypt, the gradual extension of the judgment system and its associated practices from an exclusively royal prerogative to a system available to all Egyptians who could afford it, was one of the most significant social developments in Egyptian religious history. In the Old Kingdom, the full afterlife journey and the judgment were understood as the exclusive preserve of the pharaoh. Ordinary Egyptians participated in the afterlife system only as the pharaoh's dependents, sharing in his blessed state by virtue of their relationship to him. By the Middle Kingdom, the texts and the beliefs had begun to be available to non-royal elites. By the New Kingdom, the system was in principle open to any Egyptian who could commission the necessary texts and funerary equipment. This democratization had complex implications. On one hand, it reflected a genuine broadening of moral and spiritual aspiration, the recognition that the divine judgment of individual lives was not a royal prerogative, but a universal condition. On the other hand, it created a system in which access to the best preparation for judgment, the most comprehensive Book of the Dead, the finest funerary equipment, the most carefully performed mummification, was still stratified by wealth. The poor person who died with minimal preparation was not entirely without recourse. The gods were understood as just, and a life genuinely lived in Maat could stand before the scales without elaborate textual backup. But the wealthy person had advantages that money could buy: better texts, better amulets, better ritual performance of the funerary rites. The field of reeds was ultimately the Egyptian answer to the question that all moral frameworks must eventually address: what is virtue for? If the person who lives by Maat, who speaks truthfully, who treats others with justice and compassion, who maintains the proper relationships with the gods and with other people, if that person dies in the same way as the unjust person, if there is no visible distinction in the world between the just and the unjust, then what is the point of Maat? The field of reeds was the answer. The distinction was invisible in the earthly life because the accounting was conducted elsewhere. After death, in the hall of two truths, the just person and the unjust person both died, but only one of them continued. The weighing of the heart did not stay in Egypt. It moved, not quickly, not completely, not always in ways that can be traced with confidence through a clean chain of transmission, but it moved, and its movement shaped ideas about judgment, justice, and the afterlife that are still with us in forms we may not immediately recognize as Egyptian in origin. The most direct influence is the one most often discussed: the relationship between the Egyptian judgment of the dead and the Christian concept of the Last Judgment. The parallels are striking enough to have generated considerable scholarly attention, though the precise mechanisms of influence remain debated. Both traditions feature a judgment that takes place after death, before a divine tribunal. Both feature a moral accounting in which the deeds of the earthly life are assessed against a divine standard. Both feature a distinction between those who pass the judgment and proceed to paradise and those who fail and experience a negative outcome, and both feature a recording angel or scribe who keeps the record, the role of Thoth in the Egyptian tradition, the role of the angels recording deeds in the Book of Life in the biblical tradition. Egypt and ancient Israel were in continuous contact across the centuries, through trade, through the period of Israelite residence in Egypt, recounted in the biblical narrative, through the later period of Egyptian cultural influence on the wider Near East during the New Kingdom period. Ideas moved between Egypt and the surrounding cultures throughout this time, and the specific idea of a divine judgment after death that assessed the moral quality of the earthly life was available in the Egyptian tradition at exactly the period when the ideas that would become Jewish and then Christian eschatology were being formed. The Zoroastrian tradition of ancient Persia provides another connection point. Zoroastrianism, which was extremely influential on the development of Jewish eschatology during the Babylonian exile period, had its own concept of a judgment of souls after death, the Chimvat Bridge, across which souls walked after death, with the righteous crossing safely to paradise and the wicked falling into the abyss. The Zoroastrian judgment shared the Egyptian tradition's emphasis on a moral accounting conducted at the boundary between life and death, and the Zoroastrian tradition had been in contact with the Egyptian tradition through the Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE and the subsequent Achaemenid rule of the country. The Platonic tradition in Greek philosophy also shows evidence of Egyptian influence, particularly in Plato's accounts of the afterlife judgment in dialogues like the Phaedo, the Republic, and the Gorgias. Plato describes a judgment of souls after death in which the deeds of the earthly life are assessed by divine judges and the soul is assigned to an appropriate destination: paradise for the virtuous, Tartarus for the wicked. The structural similarities to the Egyptian tradition are pronounced, and Plato is known to have had significant interest in Egyptian thought. His dialogue, Timaeus, attributes important cosmological ideas to Egyptian sources. The specific motif of the weighing, the balance scale, as the instrument of moral assessment appears in the biblical tradition in ways that suggest Egyptian influence. The image of God holding scales in the Book of Job and in the Psalms, the repeated use of weighing as a metaphor for divine assessment throughout the Hebrew Bible, the explicit weighing scene in the Apocalypse of Peter. These reflect the cultural currency of the weighing of souls motif across the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean world, a currency that the Egyptian tradition had done much to establish. The specific motif of the weighing, the balance scale, as the instrument of moral assessment, appears in the biblical tradition in ways that suggest Egyptian influence. The image of God holding scales in the Book of Job and in the Psalms, the repeated use of weighing as a metaphor for divine assessment throughout the Hebrew Bible, the explicit weighing scene in the Apocalypse of Peter. These reflect the cultural currency of the weighing of souls motif across the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean world, a currency that the Egyptian tradition had done much to establish. In the medieval Christian tradition, the weighing of souls became one of the most consistent elements of Last Judgment iconography. Timpana, above the doorways of Romanesque and Gothic churches across Europe, depicted the Archangel Michael holding scales, with souls being weighed and assigned to heaven or hell depending on the balance. The specific image, the scales, the weighing, the divine recorder, the separation of the saved from the damned, is so close to the Egyptian original that the influence, while not directly documented in any single transmission text, seems clear in retrospect. The image was too specific, too consistent, and too widely distributed to be independently invented in every location where it appeared. The psychological and philosophical dimensions of the weighing of the heart have continued to be productive in intellectual traditions far removed from any specific religious context. The idea that a life has moral weight, that it can be measured, that the measurement has an objective standard, that the measure is the quality of adherence to truth and justice rather than social success or personal happiness, is an idea that recurs in ethical thought from Kant's categorical imperative to the various traditions of virtue ethics that ask not what should I do in this situation, but what kind of person should I become. The feather of Maat as a moral standard is perhaps the most demanding and most elegant ethical criterion ever devised. Not a list of rules, not a calculation of consequences, not a social contract, but the weight of cosmic truth itself. The heart that balanced the feather was the heart of a person whose life had been in alignment with the fundamental order of the universe, a person who had not merely avoided the worst violations, but had lived in positive harmony with what was right. This is a standard that most of us, if we are honest, do not entirely meet, but it is a standard whose formulation is itself clarifying, whose specificity is itself illuminating, whose challenge is itself a gift. We do not weigh hearts in the hall of two truths. We do not face Ammit. We do not recite the negative confession to 42 divine judges, but we carry, in the inherited imagination of our culture, something of what the Egyptians encoded in the weighing of the heart, the sense that a life has weight, that the weight is not simply personal but cosmic, that what we do to others and what we withhold from others accumulates in something that is, at the end of the accounting, who we were. The feather is still there, in the imagination, perfectly light, and the question it poses to every human life is unchanged across 4,000 years. Are you as light as this? Have you lived in such alignment with truth and justice and compassion that your heart could balance on the scale of the universe with a single white feather? The specific iconographic tradition of the winged heart, the heart depicted with wings, capable of flight, of movement, of freedom, appears in Egyptian funerary art as a symbol of the heart that has passed the judgment and been found worthy of the afterlife journey. The winged heart was the heart light enough to fly, the heart that had balanced the feather and been released to soar through the duat toward its destination. This image, the heart given wings by the quality of the life from which it came, is one of the most beautiful in the entire Egyptian tradition, and it has resonated through subsequent visual culture in ways that are not always recognized as Egyptian in origin. The concept of the justified dead, the Akaka who had been transformed through the judgment into a glorified spirit, was understood as having a reciprocal relationship with the living. The justified dead were not simply gone. They continued to be present in the world, able to be communicated with, able to influence events in the living world, able to offer protection and guidance to the family members they had left behind. Letters to the dead, messages written on pottery and placed in tombs, are among the most poignant survivals from ancient Egypt. Ordinary Egyptians writing to their deceased relatives to ask for help with specific problems, to report on developments in the family, to seek the intervention of the justified spirit in matters that the living could not resolve on their own. The judgment that admitted the dead person to the field of reeds did not sever their connection to the living world. It transformed it. The Egyptian weighing of the heart, viewed across the full span of its history and influence, is one of the most remarkable concepts in the history of human thought about justice, about death, and about the relationship between a life and its ultimate significance. It is remarkable for its specificity, the feather, the scale, the 42 judges, the named categories of wrongdoing, and for its comprehensiveness, the total accounting, the complete record, the universal standard. It is remarkable for its moral seriousness, the refusal to offer easy comfort, the insistence that the heart cannot be falsified in the ways that social presentation can be falsified, and it is remarkable for its persistence, the way the images and the ideas it generated continue to shape human thought about judgment and justice across 4,000 years and several civilizational transformations. The feather is still there, in the imagination, perfectly light, and the question it poses to every human life is unchanged across 4,000 years. Are you as light as this? Have you lived in such alignment with truth and justice and compassion that your heart could balance on the scale of the universe with a single white feather? Sleep well. The scale is patient. The feather is still. The specific iconography of the Archangel Michael weighing souls in medieval Christian art shows direct parallels to the Anubis at the scale imagery of the Egyptian tradition that are difficult to explain as independent inventions. Michael holds a balance scale with souls on one pan and their virtues or sins on the other. Demons attempt to pull the sin pan down, while angels attempt to lift the virtue pan. The basic structure, a divine figure, a scale, a moral measurement, a determination of fate based on the measurement, is identical to the Egyptian scene. The specific difference is Michael is winged. The souls are depicted as small human figures rather than as hearts. The opposing parties are explicitly good and evil rather than simply heavy and light, reflect the cultural transformation that the motif underwent as it moved from the Egyptian to the Christian context. The modern psychological concept of the guilty conscience, the inner voice that records wrongdoing and produces the specific discomfort that we call guilt, is, in the most generous interpretation, a secular version of the Egyptian aib and its record-keeping function. The conscience that reminds us of what we have done wrong, that produces the physical sensation of guilt that resembles, as we noted in the introduction, the metaphorical heaviness of a heavy heart. This is the Egyptian understanding of the heart as the keeper of the record, translated into the language of psychology and stripped of its supernatural framework. We still believe at some level that the heart keeps score. We still speak of a clear conscience and a guilty conscience, of being burdened by guilt and freed from it. The Egyptian tradition gave this perennial human experience its most elaborate and most beautiful symbolic expression. 4,000 years later, the expression resonates because the experience it encodes is unchanged. Sleep well, the scale is patient, the feather is still.